Welcome everyone. My name is Catherine Teichen, and I'm the Clean Energy Program Specialist with Minnesota Housing. Thank you very much for joining us for this webinar on the Phase II EnergyScoreCards Minnesota pilot. Minnesota Housing provides access to safe, decent, and affordable housing and builds stronger communities across the state. Minnesota Housing offers products and services to help Minnesotans buy and fix up their homes and to stabilize neighborhoods, communities, and families. It also supports the development and preservation of affordable rental housing through both financing and long-term asset management. It has pioneered a successful model for supportive housing that helps stabilize the lives of some of the state's most vulnerable citizens. Now, a quick look at our agenda for the afternoon. We've started with housekeeping and we'll move on to introductions. Next, we'll discuss the purpose, history, and design of the project. Then my colleague from Center for Energy and Environment will review the quantitative results. And finally, we'll end with the qualitative results and general recommendations. Following that, we'll have our Q&A session. So again, my name is Catherine Teichen, and I'm with Minnesota Housing. I'm joined today by Ashley McFarland from Center for Energy and Environment, who provided technical assistance and statistical analysis throughout Phase II. John Brayman with Bright Power is also here, and he will be able to answer any questions you might have about the original pilot or about the EnergyScoreCards web platform. I would also like to take this time to thank the owners and managers who participated in the Phase II EnergyScoreCards Minnesota project. They are Catholic Charities of St. Paul in Minneapolis, Hayes Gibson, Hope Community, Jeremiah Program, Model Cities, NAS Management, Nationwide Housing, the Olmsted County HRA, RS Eden, Twin Cities Housing Development Corporation, and finally, the YWCA of St. Paul. Phase II EnergyScoreCards Minnesota was part of Minnesota Housing's effort to enhance our sustainability policies. We've had an ongoing focus on sustainability within new construction and rehabilitation projects. Phase II allowed us to extend this focus into our existing portfolio. Phase II's key objectives were, number one, to reduce utility costs in targeted buildings, and number two, to compare the potential utility savings with the cost of monitoring buildings, providing technical assistance, and helping to finance the retrofits. Other objectives included, one, assessing the interest of multifamily owners and property managers in investing in energy and water efficiency. Two, assessing the usefulness of using utility benchmarking in order to improve energy and water management. And number three, assessing the compatibility of utility incentive programs with Minnesota Housing's existing programs. Beginning in 2012, the original EnergyScoreCards project studied energy and water benchmarking in over 500 multifamily buildings in Minnesota. Of those 500 buildings, 129 were affordable multifamily buildings in Minnesota Housing's portfolio. The original pilot split these buildings into two groups. The first group was a treatment group that had 2 full years of access to the EnergyScoreCards benchmarking tool. The second group was a control group that had its energy and water consumption tracked, but did not have access to the tool until after the pilot was completed. The partners from the original pilot include Minnesota Housing, Minnesota Green Communities, the Center for Sustainable Building Research, and the Center for Energy and Environment. The original pilot was funded through a collaboration between Xcel Energy, the Minnesota Department of Commerce, and Minnesota Housing. The original pilot resulted in a statistically significant savings of 5% energy savings and 30% water savings in master metered buildings that received the EnergyScoreCards service for 2 years in comparison to that control group. After the completion of the original pilot, Minnesota Housing followed up with some of the worst performing buildings that had participated. Many of the owners and property managers from those poor performing buildings stated that in the original pilot, they had not utilized the EnergyScoreCards benchmarking tool or the associated resources, which included guides, webinars, and newsletters to the fullest potential. They brought up several issues from the original pilot, which include, number one, a lack of understanding about if and how their buildings compared to other buildings in the EnergyScoreCards tool. Two, a lack of support to pinpoint the underlying issues that were causing poor scores in EnergyScoreCards, and a lack of direction and support for where improvements could be made. And three, a lack of funding to implement energy savings projects. Minnesota Housing decided to pursue Phase II as a follow-up to the original pilot. Ultimately, 31 buildings that had an EnergyScoreCards grade of C or D at the end of the original pilot were able to join Phase II. Phase II gave these 31 buildings an additional 2 years of access to the EnergyScoreCards benchmarking platform. This web-based platform also provided automatic retrieval and collection of owner and property manager paid utility accounts, energy management tools, such as the property scorecard, calculation of weather and space adjusted metrics, and comparison to other multifamily buildings. Participants also received free technical assistance from the Center for Energy and Environment. This included individual quarterly check-in calls about each building and one-on-one in-person assistance. Specific Center for Energy and Environment tasks included troubleshooting high utility bills, evaluating water efficiency opportunities, responding to maintenance and other improvement questions, evaluating utility incentive program recommendations for reasonableness, and other project implementation assistance, such as bid guidance and quality assurance checks. Minnesota Housing provided assistance navigating financial programs. This includes utility incentive programs, such as Excel and CenterPoint's multifamily building efficiency program, city programs, such as the City of Minneapolis's Green Business Cost Share program, and Minnesota Housing funded programs, including our consolidated RFP and our publicly owned housing program. Minnesota Housing also provided access to small amounts of grant funding, averaging less than $5,000 per property. Minnesota Housing encouraged all 31 participants to participate in utility incentive programs. 29 of the participants were eligible for Excel and CenterPoint's multifamily building efficiency program. The remaining 2 participants were eligible for other traditional prescriptive rebates from their utilities. 16 buildings ultimately applied to the multifamily building efficiency program, which included free energy assessments, free direct install services of LED lighting and low flow devices, and access to deep performance-based rebates. By the end of Phase II, 23 out of the 31 buildings had implemented at least one energy or water efficiency project. Over a total of $160,000 was spent by participants on energy and water efficiency projects. Of that, Minnesota Housing reimbursed roughly $39,000 through the small grants that were offered. But note that not every participant applied for grant funds. Participants ultimately completed a total of 95 energy or water efficiency projects. The project types include heating, ventilation, air conditioning, lighting, water, and domestic hot water. One thing to note, almost 50% of the projects were completed in the final year of Phase II. And 6 of the participants had projects that were completed in the final 3 months. Because it is preferred to have at least a full year's worth of data, these late completions may have added a conservative bias to the statistical results. I'm now happy to hand it over to Ashley McFarland with the Center for Energy and Environment to discuss the quantitative results in more depth.
Thank you, Catherine. So yeah, I'm gonna hop a bit into the quantitative results, or the numbers that we saw at the end of the pilot. So if we first look at the EnergyScoreCard Grades, just a reminder, the buildings selected for this pilot had a high energy usage or low scores at the end of the first phase. At the end of this phase of the pilot, 55% saw an improvement in their overall grade, and 35% had relatively no change to their grade. About 10% had their grade worsen. To better understand how these grades changed, we looked at the Energy Use Index. We define the change in Energy Use Index as the annual weather-normalized energy use per square foot. To evaluate the change in the Energy Use Index, we compared the most recent year to the 2015 Energy Use Index. 2015 was selected as the baseline year since it's the year before the pilot began, or this phase of the pilot began in 2016. In this figure, a negative value indicates an energy saving. The middle line indicates the median, the black dot shows the mean, and the red triangle indicates an outlier. 50% of the properties fall within the green boxes. From this box plot, you can see there's a wide range of changes in energy use index across the participants. Looking at the master metered properties on the left, the mean and median change in energy use index indicate an energy saving, whereas on the right, properties with central heat and hot water showed a slight increase in energy use index or increase in energy use. So if we break this down further into electric and natural gas, we see that the change in this plot, a positive value indicates a savings. So green means energy savings. When we look at the change in energy use index by field type, we see all metering configurations showed a small decrease in electric use, but only the master meter properties showed a decrease in natural gas use. We can break this a bit further and look into the cost metrics. For the cost metrics, we looked at 2 different averages. On the left, I've got the building averages. So with the building averages, we took the total utility savings for each building, so your water, electric, and natural gas cost savings, and then averaged it over all the participants. With this calculation approach, larger buildings have a greater impact on the average. And then we also looked at the per unit averages. So we took those cost savings, divided it by the number of units, and then averaged, which gave each property an equal weight in the average. So if we first looked at the master meter properties, for these properties, the owner pays for all utilities, so the heat, domestic hot water, electric, and water. Looking at the change in utilities for the buildings as a whole and not on a square footage basis, we see the electric consumption decreased, but natural gas increased. Comparing the per unit to per building averages, the sign on the electric and natural gas cost savings, the sign on the electric and natural gas cost savings changes. The sign flipping indicates larger buildings saved more on electric, but used more gas. and smaller buildings saved more on gas but used more electric. There's more details on how these values are calculated in the report, and I'd also be happy to answer any questions at the end. Our next category of buildings have central heat and hot water. So the tenant was responsible for in-unit electric usage, and the owner of the property was responsible or paid for space heating and water heating. In these 17 buildings, one had a meter configuration where the tenant was responsible for cooling, and the remaining 16, the owner paid for the cooling. These buildings showed an electric cost savings and a water cost savings. This is true both when we look at the building average and the per unit average. For natural gas, buildings with this meter configuration showed an increase in the utility bills. Our next category are buildings with central hot water only. So in this category, the tenant is responsible for in-unit electric, heating, and heating. The owner is responsible for water heating or pays for the natural gas bill for water heating. These buildings also showed an electric cost savings and a water cost savings, which is true for both the building average and the per unit average. But these buildings also showed an increase in the natural gas bills. The total cost of the pilot was $143,780. This accounts for Minnesota Housing, CEE, and Bright Power staff time, as well as the grant reimbursements that Catherine mentioned earlier, and the EnergyScoreCards subscription. The total weather normalized electric, natural gas, and water cost savings for the pilot participants was about $50,840. or about 3% of the 2015 utility bills. A key point to note when looking at this figure is that the point that Catherine brought up earlier, which is that about half of the projects that were completed were done in the final year. So this savings figure may not capture the energy savings from all of the projects that were completed in this phase. So if we compare this cost savings to the cost, the payback is about 2 years and 10 months. Now I'll pass it back to Catherine.
At the completion of Phase II, 9 out of the 11 participating owners and property managers agreed to do a final interview with us to discuss how the pilot went. There were several things that they overwhelmingly liked. Number one, participants liked having access to a single point of contact with a real person that they could turn to in order to ask questions and get feedback. Number two, participants liked having access to grant reimbursement. Although the grant reimbursement was small, it still allowed them to pursue a project that they may not have been able to financially afford otherwise. And the participants agreed that the grant reimbursement process was easy, fast, and flexible. Number three, participants liked having access to the benchmarking data. They specifically mentioned that they liked the visual graphs, the ability to personalize and specify the data in order to suit their needs, and the ability to use the data in order to tell a story and justify the need for improvement. 4, they liked having access to additional technical support, including in-person building assessments. They appreciated having a real person to talk to discuss potential projects, best practices, and to be able to troubleshoot with and ask questions. They relied on the regular check-ins to encourage discipline and accountability and to help move the projects forward. Ultimately, the majority of participants indicated that the energy savings projects that they pursued and implemented would not have taken place at all or would not have taken place as quickly if they had not participated in Phase II. However, that is not to say that Phase II was without its issues. There were several barriers that participants felt prevented them from doing more and deeper projects. Participants felt that there was a lack of staff capacity and financial resources at the participant/organizational level. They also felt that the benchmarking data was overwhelming and at times still unclear. And finally, they felt that there was still a lack of clarity around which potential energy savings solutions they should pursue. So there are 5 general recommendations and takeaways that we have from Phase 2 that can be applied to other potential programs and policies. First, make it easy to participate. Energy efficiency projects may be a lower priority for affordable housing owners and managers compared to health and safety projects. Similarly, staff capacity and a lack of financial resources may also hinder the number and scope of energy projects that affordable housing owners and managers are able to pursue. Second, have a real person available to answer questions and provide support. Having access to in-person, one-on-one assistance is critical. A single point of contact where participants can ask detailed technical questions, have help navigating complex programs, be held accountable and on task will all help keep projects moving. Third, keep project timelines flexible. It takes a substantial length of time for owners and property managers to track utilities, participate in utility incentive programs, plan and design projects, seek out bids, and then secure financing, all prior to being able to complete their project. Fourth, incentivize projects where the owner or manager may not see the financial benefit. As we've indicated today, master metered buildings are much more likely to see the financial benefits. In individually metered properties, where tenants are responsible for paying their own utilities, some of the financial benefits will likely be reflected on those tenant utility statements. In these cases, extra incentives might be needed to help owners be able to implement projects in those types of buildings. And finally, be sure to provide information on the non-financial and non-energy benefits of potential projects. Energy and water efficiency projects can also help increase the overall health, safety, and comfort of the building. Healthier and more efficient buildings can decrease instances of resident illness, which will both decrease missed school and work, as well as decrease associated medical. So that is the end of the slides that we have prepared for today. Thank you very much for joining us. We've got about 25 minutes or so for questions, and so we will now move into our Q&A session. So one question was, what is the breakdown of how the 95 projects were funded, rebates versus loans versus grants? So the majority of the projects were funded directly by the owner or the property manager. Some of the projects applied to Minnesota Housing to get grant funding, but those grant amounts were less than $5,000 per building. We also encouraged buildings to apply to their utility for utility incentives. Not all of the buildings that pursued projects did apply to their utility, but we had 16 buildings apply to the utility incentive programs, and we had 23 buildings complete projects. So obviously some buildings completed projects without applying to their utility. We also had at least one, possibly two buildings that pursued city-based programs. The city of Minneapolis has a matching program called the Green Business Cost Share Program. And we had, yeah, I don't know if there were any other funding.
Yeah, and I think from the utility funding, it was a mix of participating in the multifamily building efficiency program and then taking advantage of prescriptive rebates.
Okay, we had another question come in. Does MHFA have plans to continue funded benchmarking or technical assistance in the future? So that's a great question. That's definitely something that our senior leadership team is currently considering. One of our priorities right now is to focus on updating our sustainability standards. Minnesota Housing requires projects that are being funded through our consolidated RFP process to follow the Enterprise Green Communities criteria with the Minnesota overlay. Those national criteria, the Enterprise criteria, are currently being updated, and the 2020 criteria should be finalized and released in December or January. And then Minnesota Housing will be doing a stakeholder process to update our Minnesota Housing overlay to those criteria. So we're working on that, but we also don't want to forget the existing portfolio and our asset management. So, you know, I hope that we'll continue this program in some form, but I don't have anything official to announce to you just yet. I will say one thing about our Green Communities criteria. In the Enterprise Green Communities criteria, there was a benchmarking requirement. We took that requirement out in our Minnesota overlay. However, since those criteria are going to be updated, since we've seen how beneficial benchmarking can be, and since some local cities within the state of Minnesota now have their own energy disclosure and benchmarking policies, it is something that we're considering revising our stance on, and potentially could have a benchmarking policy moving forward. Nothing is set in stone yet, and it's just something we're thinking about, but something for folks to keep an eye on, and definitely if you're interested in having that conversation with us, we'd love to hear from you. Was there any preference for the EnergyScoreCards tool versus other benchmarking tools? So for this phase 2, we used the EnergyScoreCards tool because that was the tool that was used in the original pilot. We had great support from John Brayman at Bright Power with his EnergyScoreCards tool, and it made sense to us that since these buildings had already used the tool, were hopefully at least a little familiar with it, and had, you know, years of data starting in 2012 to continue with using the EnergyScoreCards tool. In terms of any future plans of what tool to use, I can't say that we would require building owners or managers to use a specific paid tool. We'd likely ask for data to be provided using a free method. Maybe I'll let John Brayman speak in case there was anything that you wanted to say to folks. John, you should be unmuted if you want to say anything to anyone.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine and Ashley. It was great to be part of phase 2 as a follow-on to phase 1, and I think a lot of interesting conclusions that you all have brought out from it. So I don't have any particular different messages, but thanks for the ongoing partnership here.
I want to thank everyone who attended this webinar today. We really appreciate having you all here. If anyone does have any follow-up questions, my email address is on the screen. It's just catherine.teichen@state.mn.us. And if you have questions for Ashley McFarland at Center for Energy and Environment or John Brayman at Bright Power, you can send those to me and I'll make sure they get to the right person. Again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and we hope you have a good rest of your afternoon.